So Ben did a great job in that last session talking to us about what it means to be gospel-centered. And I want to, before we get into gospel culture, I kind of want to take a moment and just recognize that if we are not careful, what we'll do is we'll hear everything that Ben talked about how it's all by grace, and then we'll start thinking about gospel culture, and we'll start thinking about our churches, and what we'll do is we'll walk out of here with a list of things to do. And what we'll do is we'll turn gospel centrality, gospel doctrine, gospel culture into a new legalism. We might not be telling people they need to keep food laws. We might not be telling people they need to get circumcised, but we might say in order to really be a Christian, you've got to be gospel-centered like I am. See, we're really good at making laws for people to follow. And so that's not my goal. My goal is to hopefully give you some practical helps, but if you're going to walk out of here with a list, please talk to me before you go so I can cross off the things on your list and just write Jesus down, because that's what we're after today. And so what we want to do in this session is to focus on what it means to be gospel-centered in our culture. And so right now, if all of us were to pile into my minivan and drive back to Hannibal, Missouri, where I'm from, I pastor Believers Church in Hannibal, Missouri. I've been there for 12 years. This weekend, our church is celebrating our 15th anniversary, and so we're pretty excited about that. But on Saturday, my wife and I and our 5 daughters moved into a new house. We bought a house that has 85 bathrooms because that's how many we're going to need, because we have lots of girls. And all of our stuff in our home is everywhere. And a good, 70 to 80% of those boxes are book boxes. I took about 2 weeks to pack my offices and about 3 days to pack everything else in our house. And so I've got all these books, all these commentaries, these systematic theologies, these Christian living books, all these books that are just in boxes in my basement right now. And if I was to leave those in the boxes, they wouldn't be of any use to me. Right? Gospel culture is where we unpack those boxes, where we take all that truth that Ben talked about in the last session, where we take all those indicatives that Paul gives us in his letters, and we start to think about how those work themselves out in our lives and in the life of the church. And so today, my goal is to answer 4 questions. Question 1 is, what is gospel culture? Question 2 is why do you need it? Question 3 is, why does your church need it? And then question 4 is, how do we lead out in this? And honestly, my main goal is question number 2. I want us to understand what gospel culture is, but my heart is that you as a pastor and that I as a pastor would get why we need this before we even begin to think about why our churches need it. And so Ray Ortlund says that the test of a gospel-centered church is its doctrine on paper plus its culture in practice. And that's important because over the last few decades, there's been this resurgence towards gospel-centered doctrine, and that's a great thing. That's something that we should celebrate. However, the culture piece often gets missed. It kind of lags behind, and I think that if we're honest with ourselves, we'll realize that the reason why that's the case is because doctrine is a whole lot easier to get right than culture is. Right? And so if right now I was to pass around a gospel theology test, right, I think most of us would probably do pretty well on it. Right? If I was to pass out a gospel theology test to the people that go to your churches, that sit under your preaching and teaching, hopefully they would do pretty well too. But what if I passed out a culture test? What if I asked, do you forgive as Christ has forgiven you? What if I asked, do you welcome others as Christ has welcomed you? Do you love your wife as Christ loved the church? Are you kind? Are you honest? Are you hospitable? Are you generous? Are you humble? Are you gracious? Right? Is the gospel working itself out in your life? What if I gave that test to your wife, to your kids, to your friends, your family, your church, I think that most of us would probably do worse on that test. I'm not saying that so that you feel guilty or I feel guilty. Right? It's not so that we beat ourselves up because we fall short. It's to recognize together that culture in the life of the church is harder to get right than doctrine is. That's why it's important. That's why we need to be intentional about focusing on creating gospel culture in our church. And the reason why it matters, the reason why gospel culture matters, the reason why talking about it and thinking about it and focusing on it matters is because our culture speaks louder and more clearly and more often than our doctrine does. Right? When people come into our church, that's what they experience. That's what they feel. That's what they hear more than the things that we say from the stage. And it's entirely possible that our church culture is saying something that contradicts what our church doctrine says. Maybe we say in Christ everyone is accepted, but when people come through our doors, they don't feel that. So question one, what is gospel culture? So culture is just the way of life of a group of people, right? It's how they do things, their kind of system of shared beliefs and attitudes and actions. It's how they do life together. So gospel culture then is a way of life that is so shaped by the truths and implications of the gospel that Jesus is put on display in the life of his people. Gospel culture, it's a way of life that's so shaped by the truths and implications of the gospel that Jesus is put on display in the life of his people. So it's all that stuff that Ben talked about, fleshed out in the mundane, day-to-day bits and pieces of our lives, right? It's when those things work themselves out in us and what we do and how we live. And so, for example, look with me at Galatians 2. Listen to what Paul says here, Galatians 2:11 through 14. It says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" So Paul here is rebuking Peter and the others who go along with him. He says, because in verse 14, their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. So what they were doing, the way that they were living, the way that they were behaving, their culture was not in step with the gospel. Look at what Paul says to Peter in front of everybody. "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" So Peter, before these guys show up from Jerusalem, he wasn't living like a Jew. Instead, he was living like a Gentile. He was eating like a Gentile. He was having some of those bacon sandwiches that Ben talked about earlier. Right? He wasn't following the Old Testament food laws. He wasn't requiring the people around him to follow the Old Testament food laws. But when those people show up from Jerusalem, Peter changes his tune. He changes his behavior. He separates himself. He draws back. He started acting like, he started living like he was under law and not under grace. He started living in a way that denied justification by faith alone. He denied the gospel through his culture. He was out of step with the gospel, Paul says. All right, that's a negative example. That's a bad example, but it helps us to see how we want the culture in our church to line up with the doctrine in our church. We want that gospel doctrine to flow out into gospel culture. Now, let me give you a positive example. Romans 15:7 says, "Therefore, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God." So here, Paul tells the church at Rome what to do, how to do it, and why to do it. He's addressing the culture that they should have in their church. It should be warm and inviting. It should be hospitable. It should be welcoming. They should welcome one another. That's what they're supposed to do. But how are they to do that? He says as Christ has welcomed them. So their understanding of the gospel, their understanding of how Jesus has saved them, has welcomed them in, has accepted them, right? That's the basis for how they should welcome other people. Their culture should be flowing out of their doctrine, right? Jesus has welcomed me, so I should welcome other people. And why should they do this? For the glory of God, so that the majesty and beauty of Jesus is put on display in the life of the church. When our gospel doctrine, what we know to be true about who Jesus is and what he's done for us, when it works itself out in the life of the church, God is glorified. He is lifted up before the people in our church and in our community. They see Jesus. They get a glorious glimpse of him that they wouldn't get otherwise. Because the gospel is working itself out in the life of the church. Our gospel doctrine is making its way out in gospel culture. So gospel culture is a way of life that's so shaped by the gospel that Jesus has put on display in the life of his church. So that's question one. Question two, why do you need it? And again, the you here that I'm talking to is pastors. Right? I know not everybody in this room is a pastor, but I want to specifically address today the need that we pastors have for gospel culture. And I want to do that by telling you a story. So not this past Sunday, not 2 days ago, but last Sunday, so the day before Labor Day, I woke up at about 1 a.m. to this kind of crashing, thumping sound in our house. And so I sleepily make my way out of bed, up the stairs, and I find, like, on the floor, my 12-year-old daughter collapsed, unconscious. She had been sick, fighting off a stomach bug, and we were struggling to keep her hydrated, but fluids kept coming back up. We had taken her to the doctor. We thought that she was just getting better, but it was taking a while. And then, we find her, and like she came to not long after I found her, and she was herself, but like a sicker version of herself. And so we took her to the ER, mostly to get her head checked out, because there were book boxes in the hallway where she fell, and we wanted to figure out what was going on. And so they go, and they checked her out. They said her head is okay, but the rest of her isn't. And so not long after that, she was transferred to Cardinal Glennon in St. Louis. And so at almost the exact time I would have been standing in front of the church preaching on Sunday, I was following my wife and daughter who were in an ambulance headed to St. Louis. Now, to press rewind a bit, about 16 months before today, 16 months ago, we did a series in our church on gospel culture. Where as elders, we looked at, hey, we think there are some key ways in which our doctrine isn't being worked out in the life of our church that we need to address. And so on May 2nd, 2021, I preached a sermon on neediness, on how, like, we are needy people. That's one of the things the gospel tells us. And it tells us that God meets our need out of his abundance. And so when we see the reality of our need, what that should do for us is it should make it so that we don't have to put on a false front of self-reliance, but we can admit, hey, I'm a needy person. Like, I'm broken. I need God. I need people outside of myself. And now when I preached that sermon, like I believed the things I said, and I strived to put them into practice. But you better believe that when I was following that ambulance, I found some new neediness that I didn't know what was there. Right? I wrestled with unbelief in ways that I hadn't before. I wondered, how could God be good? Like, I'm reformed. I know he's good. I know he's in control. I know he's powerful. But how could he be all of those things and let this happen to my daughter? With about every mile I drove, I found some new darkness and despair in me. And I'm sharing this with you because I know a lot of pastors who don't have anyone to share those kinds of things with. right? Who just have to figure out how to wrestle with those kinds of things on their own. You know, like maybe they could ask their church to pray for my daughter, but not really share the things that they actually need prayer for in those moments. Pastors, you need gospel culture in your churches for the good of your own heart. Right? So that you can be real about where you're at and what's going on in you, so that you can be vulnerable, not just with some people at your church, but with all the people at your church. Right? So that you can talk about your struggles. You can talk about your doubts. You can talk about the things that are going well and the things that aren't going well, so that you can say to your people the things that you don't feel like you can say to anyone. Gospel culture creates an environment in our churches where we realize that we're all okay in Jesus, so it's okay for us not to be okay. Right? In that car, I was not okay. And thankfully, we have a church where I can share that with them. I don't have to pretend like I'm the pastor guy that has it all together. Pastors are some of the most lonely people I know. I think it's because we feel like we do always have to have it together. And we can't let people see that we don't, because then they'll realize that we don't have it all together. But I want to let you in on a little secret. People know that you don't have it all together. And if they don't know that, that's not good for them or for you. Jesus was perfect in our place, so we don't have to be. And people need to know that we are not, so that we're pointing to Him, so that they're looking to Him. Right? Our job as pastors, our goal as pastors is not that people would hold us in high regard. Our goal is that they would hold Jesus in high regard. And so our role is to be real about the fact that we're not Him, so that they'll look to Him instead of us. Right? Jesus is the only one who's ever been okay. You're not okay, I'm not okay, so let's just quit pretending like we are. Let's quit trying to hide. Let's be honest with ourselves and with our people about who we really are as people and as pastors. And you know what? Some people might leave your church. Oh well, you're still okay in Jesus. I don't want to leave you hanging, so I'll tell you the end of the story. My daughter, all 5 of them, are at school today. Perfectly healthy and mostly happy. They're at school. She had a really strange case of strep throat and a particularly nasty stomach virus at the same time. So much so that we had all these doctors coming in to check her out because it was such a weird case. She got an obscene amount of tests, fluids, antibiotics, and we got sent home on Wednesday just in time to move on Saturday. And we prayed with her right before we left the parking garage, just thanking God. That he saved her. For all the people that cared for us and prayed for her. We were needy, and we were open and vulnerable and broken about that. And God met our need out of His abundance. Right? Tons and tons and tons of people prayed for her. People sent gift cards so that we didn't have to eat gross hospital food. People took care of our kids and took meals to our kids who were at home. They took them to the playground on Labor Day. They drove kids to school. They met other needs that came up. Jesus' glory was on display in the life of His people. It was beautiful. It gave us hope. It kept us going. Pastor, you need gospel culture in the life of your church. I know I do. And I know that more now than I did a week ago. Question 3. Why does your church need gospel culture? This one's going to be short and sweet. I mean, they need it for the same reasons you do. Right? We, as people, we grow in our faith in community. This is who God made us to be, right? It's not good for man to be alone. We were designed for community. Gospel culture is the kind of community that we need to flourish. We need a place where we can be open about who we really are so that we can learn who Jesus really is. We need to be with people who are vulnerable and honest and kind and hospitable and generous, people that it's okay to not be okay around. We need to be in a place where people genuinely love one another. Ray Ortlund talks about how what we need to grow is the gospel plus safety plus time. We need the truths of the gospel in an environment in which it's safe to be ourselves, and then time with those people for the Spirit to work and grow us. We need to be in a place where it's okay to not be perfect because we're not. We need that kind of community, and that's exactly what our people need. A place where the gospel is not only professed from the stage, but lived out in the lives of the people. So question 4. How do we lead out on this? The answer is not come up with a list and check those boxes. A short answer, I think, is that if you show people that you need this kind of environment in the church, they'll see they need it too. But I want to read you the beginning of 1 Timothy 3. This will make sense in a minute, I think. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So we've probably heard this passage more times than we can remember. Right? We're not going to walk through the passage. Instead, I just kind of want to point out one thing, kind of step back from the passage and think about it. What I want to point out, and I'm sure some of you have realized this before, but these qualifications are not that exceptional. Right? Sometimes I think we read them and we think like, okay, there's this like kind of general qualifications for normal Christians, and then we've got like phase 2 is deacon, and then phase 3, like the real super Christians are the overseers, elders, pastors, right? Because that's us in this room, and so we're obviously better than the people that aren't in this room, right? But that's just not how this works. Right? These are things that Paul would expect of pretty much any follower of Jesus. Right? It's not like he's okay with non-elders or deacons being adulterers or drunkards. Right? Maybe you could single out above reproach or able to teach and say those are kind of specific ones just for these people. But shouldn't any Christian be able to kind of communicate doctrinal truths to someone else? Shouldn't every Christian kind of strive for a life that is meeting God's high standard? So these aren't that crazy. They're things that we could encourage any Christian towards. And I think the point is that elders and deacons and overseers, they're not these exceptional super Christians. Instead, we're just people who are leading by example in these ways. Right? We're people that can be put in front of the church and say, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. And it's the same with gospel culture. Right? If we want our churches to grow in a more specific way, let's lead out by example in that specific way. And so a specific thing, we talked about Romans 15:7 earlier, right? If you want people in your church to start welcoming others as Christ has welcomed them, then start welcoming others as Christ has welcomed you, right? Start showing hospitality. We just read those qualifications. One of the qualifications for a pastor is to be hospitable. Notice that's not on the pastor's wife, that's on the pastor. Right? And so if you want your church to be more welcoming, be more welcoming. Invite people into your home, into your life, into your business. Right? Talk to them about what's going on with you. Accept them as Christ has accepted you. And people will see your example. They'll say, hey, he had me in his house. Maybe I should invite someone into mine. Right? I think that we like to overcomplicate things because it gets us off the hook so we don't have to do it. But it's pretty simple. Right? We look to Jesus. We see who he is. We look at ourselves. We see all the ways in which we're not like him. And we pick one and say, I want to be more like Jesus here. We just follow him. So let's be people that start living out the gospel in our church. Let's model it in our preaching. Don't heap up burdens on people. Give them the grace of the gospel. Lloyd Jones said that, right, if people aren't throwing the charge of antinomianism at you, like lawlessness, you're not preaching the gospel right. But also, like if you feel like you're failing to lead out in any of these areas, if you think maybe I'm not a great example to my church, I've got good news for you. You're surrounded by other people who are going to fail to lead out perfectly in these areas. Right? And this is a place, more than any other place, this is a place where we should be able to be real with one another. Where as pastors, we can talk to each other about the struggles we have, about how hard it is to be in ministry sometimes. Maybe you feel like quitting. Maybe you feel like it's going great and like you're the hero of the story. And the Spirit's convicting you about that. Maybe your marriage is struggling because of all the time you spend on the church. Maybe you feel like you're an absentee father because you're too busy doing ministry to parent your kids. This is a place where we can share those things with one another. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to transition to a time of prayer. And the goal is for us to actually pray for one another. To acknowledge the need that we have out loud to another human being and have them encourage us and pray. And so I would encourage you to be vulnerable, to open up, because if you can't do it here, there's no way you're going to be able to do it to people in your church. So I think Ben's going to come.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Just the reality, we know gospel doctrine, but